All right. Good evening, everyone. How are you? Welcome to our first session of our Compelling Conversation series. My name is Naomi Carlisle. I'm your Equity and Compliance Officer. I am so happy to be here this evening. I'm so happy to start off our Compelling Conversation series and even more excited for who we have starring for us tonight. We want to welcome José Olivarez to BHCC. He is our one book poet this year, and everything has been amazing. And I can't think of a better way of starting this series. This year, we decided that we are going to highlight men of color. And, there's been a lot going on in this country, in this world. And we wanted to put the spotlight on men of color for this series. And this is our beginning. So I want to say welcome. Hello to everyone. I hope you're having a great evening and a great beginning of semester. We're still in a pandemic. Things are quite difficult still, but we're pushing through, and we're trying to figure things out, day by day. So I just want to say welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoy the program. Carlos?
Thank you, Naomi. I want to take this time to, first of all, thank the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for this compelling conversation, as well as the Office of College Events and Cultural Planning, and all the collaborators that have made this event possible during our Hispanic Heritage Month. José Olivarez, who is our speaker for tonight, he is an award-winning poet, author, and educator. Es un poeta que ha ganado muchos premios, es autor y también es educador. So, José's book of poems, Citizens Illegal, won the 2018 Chicago Review of Books Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the Penn Gene Stein Award. He is the co-author of Home Court 2014 published and the co-host of the Poetry Podcast. The Poetry Gods, the son of Mexican immigrants, Olivarez earned a BA from Harvard University. He has received fellowships from Canto Mundo, Poets House, the Bronx Council on the Arts, the Poetry Foundation, and the Conversation Literary Festival. In 2019, he was awarded a Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation. His work has been featured in Breakbeat Poets, the ADRA Journals, the Rumpus, and Hyperallergic, the Paris Review, and elsewhere. He is a co-editor of Breakbeat Poets 4, Latinx, published by Haymarket Books. So this evening, it is truly an honor and my distinct pleasure to welcome José to Bunker Hill Community College and to our compelling conversation. And as the 2021-2022 One Book Program author, this evening, I just present to some and introduce to others our distinct guest, José Olivarez. Can we just welcome him? You can use all of your devices through Zoom to just give him a Bunker Hill welcome even right now. José, the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you, Bunker Hill. Thank you for all of your emojis. I'm seeing them pop up on my screen. I really appreciate it. Saludos a todos los estudiantes. Thank you to all the students for joining, all of the staff. My name is José Guadalupe Olivarez. I'm honored to be here with Bunker Hill Community College. And before I get started, I want to say, if this is your first time going to a poetry reading, I want you to know that I think that poetry is an interactive art. And so some people, when they hear poetry, they react like they're in a museum, right? They don't want to touch anything. They get kind of scared. They want to be quiet. I want to welcome you. I want you to enjoy yourself. I want you to have a good time. And so if you're feeling something, if a line stands out to you, you can react in the comments, in the chat, however you'd like. And yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation together, looking forward to our conversation throughout the evening. I'm going to get started by reading a poem called Mexican American Disambiguation. It's after a poet named Idris Goodwin. My parents are Mexican, who are not to be confused with Mexican Americans or Chicanos. I am a Chicano from Chicago, which means I'm a Mexican American with a fancy college degree and a few tattoos. My parents are Mexican, who are not to be confused with Mexicans still living in Mexico. Those Mexicans call themselves Mexicanos. White folks at parties call them pobrecitos. American colleges call them international students and diverse. My mom was white in Mexico and my dad was mestizo. And after they crossed the border, they became diverse and minorities and ethnic and exotic. But my parents call themselves Mexicanos, who again should not be confused for Mexicanos living in Mexico. Those Mexicanos might call my family gringos, which is the word my family calls white folks, and white folks call my parents interracial. Colleges say, put them on a brochure. My parents say, ¿qué significa esa palabra? I point out that all the men in my family marry lighter skinned women. That's the Chicano in me, which means it's the fancy college degrees in me, which is also diverse in me. Everything in me is diverse, even when I eat American foods like hamburgers, which, to clarify, are American when a white person eats them and diverse when my family eats them. So much of America can be understood like this. My parents were undocumented when they came to this country. And by undocumented, I mean sin papeles. And by sin papeles, I mean royally fucked, which should not be confused with the American dream, though the two are cousins. Colleges are not looking for undocumented diversity. My dad became a citizen, which should not be confused with keys to the house. We were safe from deportation, which should not be confused with walking the plank, though they're cousins. I call that sociology, but that's just a Chicano in me who should not be confused with the diversity in me or the Mexicano in me who is constantly fighting with the upwardly mobile in me, who is good friends with the Mexican American in me, who the colleges love, but only on brochures, who the government calls non-white Hispanic or white Hispanic, who my parents call mijo, even when I don't come home so much. Cool. So that's that poem. The next poem that I'm going to read is a poem called I Love the World, So I Married It. I wrote this poem because I got that phrase from childhood stuck in my head. If you love it so much, why don't you marry it? So I wrote this poem. I love the world, so I married it. Music, even on the day my grandma died, there were mangoes, though I tasted nothing. But slowly I came back to the world in carne asada, better than I remembered. Smoke off the meat. I couldn't contain my happiness, even though it felt offensive to smile with my grandma buried and getting eaten by the flowers. And sometimes I look at my love and think I would like to stay, to put a welcome mat on our doorstep with our names hyphenated. When I was young, I believed in forever. Then my uncle died, and I knew forever included none of my family, included no friends, their stories rotting in my head until I lose them again. So I know I will divorce the world and let it keep my most treasured possessions. A 6-piece with lemon pepper and mild sauce on, all the honey of a slow kiss, my Apple Music playlist, the way mi abuelita smiled and called me Lupito. I hated that name, except when she said it. For those of you who have never been to Chicago, mild sauce is one of our delicacies. So if you ever, hopefully this pandemic fades into memory one day, but if you ever make your way to Chicago, highly recommend you find some mild sauce. I'm going to read this poem next. This poem is called No Vaporu. I wrote this poem because I read a ton of books growing up and I never saw Vaporu in any of the poems. And it felt like a huge oversight on behalf of like authors across the world. I was like, how can there be so many books written and nobody has mentioned Vaporu when everybody knows Vaporu is like the most basic medicine, the most basic remedy. So I always knew that if I wrote a book, I was gonna include Vaporu in it. So this is my poem for Vaporu. No Vaporu. Vaporu is pronounced Vaporu, like loud or chew. The label for Vaporu says it's for cough suppression, but in my house, Vaporu is for headaches, sore muscles, nightmares, and everything else. Put some Vaporu on my dad's diabetic toes and watch the sugar evaporate. Miss a day of church? Put some Vaporu on your forehead and watch forgiveness flush your cheeks. Put some Vaporu on our bank account and watch the bill collector stop calling. When I forget a word in Spanish, I take a teaspoon of Vaporu under the tongue. Boom. All right. The next poem that I want to read for you is probably one of my favorites and most emotional for me to read. This poem is called Getting Ready to Say I Love You to My Dad, It Rains. And I wrote this poem kind of hope in a place of hope, from a place of hope, thinking about trying to build a more communicative relationship with my dad. My dad is kind of like old school in the sense that the way he shows his love is kind of by providing, right? And he doesn't necessarily communicate or like give us verbal love very often. And so this is kind of a poem reaching for something different. This is called Getting Ready to Say I Love You to My Dad, It Rains. I love you, Dad, I say to the cat. I love you, Dad, I say to the sky. I love you, Dad, I say to the mirror. It rains and my mom's plants open their mouths. My dad stays on the couch. Maybe the couch opened its mouth and started eating my dad. I love you, Dad, I say to the couch, its tongue working my dad like a puppet. I hear the rain fall and think the city is drinking or making itself clean. I'm here with my dad and the TV drones on and on. So I'm not sure I hear it. My dad grunting and nodding, not the mushy stuff I was expecting. Neither of us cry, no hug or a kiss, just a grunt and a nod. I love you, Dad, I say to my dad. We sit together and watch TV. Outside it rains. My dad turns the volume up. The city is drunk. The city is singing badly in the shower. I killed the plant once because I gave it too much water. Lord, I worry that love is violence. My dad is silent and our relationship is not new or clean. I killed the plant once because I didn't give it enough water. My dad and I watch TV on a rainy day. We rinse our mouths with this water. Cool. This next poem that I'm gonna read is called The Voice in My Head Speaks English Now. And it's kind of like the title says, for a long time, my first language is Spanish. And for a long time, that was how I always translated from Spanish to English. And at some point that flipped and it was so sudden and not sudden, right? So out of nowhere. And yet at the same time, like that's what I was going to school for. But when I finally realized that that switch had happened, it caught me by surprise. So I wrote this poem. The voice in my head speaks English now. Snow finds me underneath the layers. Maybe the cold wants to hang out, take me skiing, wants me to see winter isn't a bad country. And it's not, but I'm still shivering. I make snow angels and come out snot-nosed, throat blistering. It never stops being cold. my new voice fit with coughing. My friends say summer is coming. They're lying. On gray days, I wear the sun, but it falls off my shoulders. If you catch my mom in good light, it's impossible to tell where the sun ends. I tell myself that's where I'm from, but I'm not sure. When I was a baby, I used to get fevers. Maybe that's why my parents planted me in the snow. Now I'm a long way from the fire my parents feared, and so close to this new blue flame. Word. So once again, I want to say thank you to all of you for listening and for being here. I look forward to the day that we can gather in person. I'm going to read another poem kind of along the same lines, which is a poem called, let me see if I can find it. Not that one. Oh, actually, you know what? I'll read a different one. This poem is called You Get Fat When You're in Love. And this is one of my favorite poems in the book. You get fat when you're in love. You got a little extra love on your ankles, love hanging over your belt line. Love makes it hard to fit inside your pants sometimes. Love got you buying bigger sizes, need deeper pockets for all this love. Your buttons can't hold all the love rippling up the middle of your rib cage. Love turns those shirts into accordions. You make music with this love, carry yourself like a song. When you get skinny, everyone rushes to compliment you. They want to know what your secret is. Tell me, they say, what's your secret? You look great. Call it the broke heart diet. Love left you, then you left you. Now all you have is this disappearing body. All right, this next poem is called The Interview. It's after a poet named Safia El Hillo, who I highly recommend. Safia is an incredible poet from Washington, D.C. by way of Sudan. Where is your home? In my parents' new house, there is a room for everyone except me. Where is your home? I went to Mexico and no one recognized me. Where is your home? I went to Mexico and everyone was my cousin. The radio played José José straight from my mom's mixtapes. Where you from, my cousins ask, and I point at the radio. Where is your home? It took me 3 years to hang art in my Bronx apartment. Soon after, I started getting tattoos. There I said, I'm all moved in now. Where is your home? Riding down Lakeshore Drive, listening to GCI, all the songs I was given slapped through the car like the lake slaps the shore. Where is your home? It took me 3 days to take down my art and move out of the Bronx. Is leaving always easier than arriving? Where is your home? The house I grew up in was foreclosed. There is a small note taped to the door. I still have the key, but the key opens nothing. All right. This next poem is called If Anything Is Missing, Then It's Nothing Big Enough to Remember. What do you need to know? Cañadas de Obregón is the town in Mexico. It's in Jalisco. It's where my parents were born. Other than that, I think everything else you'll be able to get. If anything is missing, then it's nothing big enough to remember. You are born where you are born, Southside Chicago, and you are born where your parents were born, Cañadas de Obregón, Mexico. And when you are born, your parents kiss in Chicago, and in Cañadas, your grandparents kiss. You are here and here, wrapped in blankets here, a name shared over coffee here. You are born both places, celebration cigars here and here. Only it's hard for one body to contain two countries. The countries go to war, and it's hard to remember you are loved by both sides or any sides. Mostly, you belong to the river that divides your countries, the way a bottle drifts to shore and no one knows how far it's traveled or where it came from, which is a lie you tell yourself, that you were not born, that you walked out of Lake Michigan, something to explain your half everything, all nothing nature. It's a lie, and you know it's a lie because your grandparents visit, and the first time you meet them, they know your name and have pictures of you. And when they return to Mexico, your cheeks are still wet from kisses. You know your picture is walking around the same town your parents grew up in. You are here and here. And it's beautiful sometimes, like on birthdays when the whole yard is full of dancing and the kitchen is hot with tortillas y tacos. Here you are safe and whole, and there is no Rio Grande splitting you. Mostly, you scissor yourself along the lines. You choose a side. You cut, and one day you wake up and the voice in your head speaks English. You stop coming around here. The old photos fade down here. Your name mispronounced here on your own tongue. Your grandparents graying like your memory of them. And you graduate from college and your classmates say, you must be so happy to be so American now. And your other classmates say, you must be so happy to leave behind Calumet City. And you don't know what you left because you have been trying to leave so much. It's hard to tell what you lost, what you kept, and what the price really was. Cool. I'm gonna read one more poem from the book, and then I'm gonna read a couple new poems and then close with one last poem from the book. Once again, I just want to say thank you to everybody for listening and for your comments in the chat. Yeah, thank you. This poem is called "My Family Never Finished Migrating, We Just Stopped." I wrote this poem. I'll say this poem was inspired by the movie Logan, which is kind of like the last movie in the Wolverine series. And I love that movie. I don't want to give away exactly how it inspired it, but I'll read the poem. My family never finished migrating, we just stopped. We invented cactus. To survive the winters, we created steel. At my dad's mill, I saw a man dressed like a Martian walk straight into the fire. The flames licked his skin, but like a pet, it never bit him. In the desert, they find our baseball caps, our empty water bottles, but never our bodies. Even the best ICE agents can't track us through the storms. But I have a theory. Some of our cousins don't care about LA or Chicago. They build a sanctuary underneath the sand, under the skin we shed, so we can wear the desert like a cobija, under the bones of our loved ones. Bones worn thin as thorns to terrorize blue agents. Bones worn thin as guitar strings, so when the wind blows, we can follow the music home. All right. So thank you all so much for listening and for reading. I'm gonna read a couple new poems, like I said, and hopefully you enjoy those, because if not, you know, I have a major problem. I'm going to start with this poem. This poem is called Ode to Tortillas. Ode to Tortillas. There's two ways to be a Mexican writer that we've discovered so far. You can be the Mexican writer who writes about tortillas, or you can be the Mexican writer who writes about croissants instead of the tortillas on their plate. Can you be a Mexican writer if you're allergic to corn? There's two ways to be a Mexican writer that are true and tested. You can write about migration, or you can write about migration. Can you be a Mexican writer if you never migrated, if your family never migrated? There's two ways to be a Mexican writer. You can translate from Spanish, or you can translate to Spanish, or you can refuse to translate altogether. There's only one wound in the Mexican writer's imagination, and it's the wound of the chancla. It's the wound of birria being sold out at the taco truck. It's the wound of too many dolores and not enough dollars. It can be argued that these are all chanclazos. Even death is a chanclazo. There's only one miracle gifted to Mexicans, and it's the miracle of never running out of cheap beer. It's the miracle of never running out of bad jokes. There's infinite ways to eat a tortilla, made in the ancient ways by hand and warmed in a comal, made with corn or with Taco Bell plastic. What about flour tortillas? Flour tortillas count if you ask San Antonio. My people, I am poly with the tortillas. You can eat tortillas with your hands or roll them up and dip them in caldo like my mom does. You can eat them with the fork and knife like my bougie cousins do. What bougie cousins? I made them up for the purpose of this poem. You can eat tortillas in tacos or warmed up by microwave and drizzled with butter. Tortillas con arroz, tortillas con frijoles. Tortillas flipped by hand or tortillas flipped with a spatula. Tortillas with eggs for breakfast. Tortillas fried and sprinkled with sugar for dessert. Hard shell tortillas, gluten-free tortillas for our mixed family. We are still discovering new ways to fold a tortilla, to cut a tortilla up, to transform a tortilla into new worlds, to feed each other with tortillas. My people, if I have children, I will teach them about tortillas, but I'm sure they'll want McDonald's. Thank you. All right. The next poem I want to read is, let's see. This poem is called Mercedes Says, Hyacinth Look Like Little Fireworks Shows. Where I grew up, we drew flowers as circles with repeating oval petals. What did we know of pistols but the pop of toy guns? We knew the names of all the fireworks, Roman candles, sparklers, rockets, and fountains. We leapt away from lit fireworks. We pointed at the sky as our hands made hyacinth, made lilies out of the night. Nevertheless, I'll never forget the day an old love brushed a flower gently over my face before kissing me. More than water, more than air, I needed to know the name of that flower. All right, let's see. Maybe a couple more of the new poems, and then I'll finish with one more poem from Citizen Illegal. This poem is called Poem Where No One is Deported. Now, I like to imagine La Migra running into the sock factory where my mom and her friends worked. It was all women who worked there, women who braided each other's hair during breaks, women who wore rosaries and never had a hair out of place, women who were ready for cameras or for God, who ended all their sentences with, si Dios quiere, as in the day before the immigration raid, when the rumor of a raid was passed around like bread, and the women made plans, si Dios quiere. So when the immigration officers arrived, they found boxes of socks and all the women absent, safe at home. Those officers thought no one was working. They were wrong. The women would say it was God working, and it was God, but the God my mom taught us to fear was vengeful. He might have wet his thumb and wiped La Migra out of this world like a smudge on a mirror. This God was the God that woke me up at 7 a.m. every day for school to let me know there was food in the fridge for me and my brothers. I never asked my mom where the food came from, but she told me anyway. Gracias a Dios. Gracias a Dios de la comida. Gracias a Dios de las mujeres. Gracias a Dios del chisme, who heard all La Migra's plans and whispered them into the right ears to keep our family safe. All right, let me see if I can find one more poem to read from this new manuscript. And then I'll close out with one last poem from Citizen Illegal. I'll read this poem. This poem is called Nation of Domination. A couple things that you need to know before I read this poem. The poem mentions Los Bukis. They're like a Mexican rock band. They happen to be like my mom's favorite band. And then it also mentions Farouk. And Farouk is an old wrestler who was betrayed by The Rock, and that kind of helped launch. This is such a nerdy poem. It helped launch The Rock's career. In Nation of Domination, the title of the poem comes, that was the group that The Rock was in. So this is the poem, Nation of Domination. My mom hugs me and wants me to stay. I have my foot on the pedal, a fake gold chain on my neck. I confess I'm a sucker. I never want magicians to reveal their secrets. I want to live in the unknowing where everything is possible. My mom dances with me to Los Bukis. She thinks this makes me her baby still. Perspective is a magic trick. I hit my brother with the rock bottom, and I bet you can guess what I leave out. Ask Farouk if you need a hint. The brain is full of magic I don't understand. No one signs up to take a dive. In wrestling, there's a team of riders who decide who wins and who loses. The metaphor is obvious. My mom wasn't born to play the role of mom. I don't care how many baby dolls she played with. I danced with my mom to Los Bukis, and you're a fool if you believe it's her son she's trying to hold on to. All right, so those are some of the new poems that I'm working on. I hope you enjoyed them. And I'm gonna close by reading one last poem from Citizen Illegal. This poem is called Mexican Heaven. And in the book, it's split up into 8 parts, but I'll read them all for you here. Once again, I just wanna thank Bunker Hill Community College and everyone involved with putting together this event. Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction, and Naomi and everyone else. Mexican Heaven. 1, all of the Mexicans sneak into heaven. St. Peter has their name on the list, but none of the Mexicans have trusted a list since Ronald Reagan was president. 2, St. Peter is a Mexican named Pedro, but he's not a saint. Pedro waits at the gate with a shot of tequila to welcome all the Mexicans to heaven, but he gets drunk and forgets about the list. All the Mexicans walk into heaven, even our no good cousins who only go to church for baptisms and funerals. 3, it turns out God is one of those religious Mexicans who doesn't drink or smoke weed, so all the Mexicans in heaven party in the basement while God reads the Bible and thumbs a rosary. God threatens to kick all the Mexicans out of heaven si no paran con las pendejadas. So the Mexicans drink more discreetly. They smoke outside where God won't smell the weed. God pretends the Mexicans are reformed. Hallelujah. This cycle repeats once a month. Amen. 4, Jesus has a tattoo of La Virgen de Guadalupe covering his back. It turns out he's your cousin Jesus from the block. It turns out he gets reincarnated every day and no one on earth cares all that much. 5, all the Mexican women refuse to cook or clean or raise the kids or pay bills or make the bed or drive you to work or do anything except watch their novelas. So heaven is gross. The rats are fat as roosters and the men die of starvation. 6, there are white people in heaven too. They build condos across the street and ask the Mexicans to speak English. I'm just kidding. There are no white people in heaven. 7, tamales, tacos, tostadas, tortas, pozole, sopes, huaraches, menudo, horchata, jamaica, limonada, agua. 8, St. Peter lets Mexicans into heaven, but only to work in the kitchens. A Mexican dishwasher polishes the crystal, smells the meals, and hears the music. They dream of another heaven, one they might be allowed in if only they work hard enough. Cool. Thank you all once again for listening. And I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
Thank you, Jose, for sharing your wealth of expression through the art of poetry. It is certainly great to have you here at Bunker Hill. And I know from the love emojis and the hand claps and all the other types of emojis that have been raised that people have been really enjoying what you have read thus far. There's a couple of questions, but before I get into the questions, I also want to acknowledge and invite Neoko Akai Dennis, who is our One Book coordinator. And she's here with a large group of our students. So we just want to acknowledge her right now. She's certainly welcome to come on camera if she's able to. And if she has any questions, she can also offer those. But we're going, as she does that, we want to begin with these two questions, which are coming from her students. So hopefully you'll be able to get a grasp of what they're asking. So the first question says, some students in my course said that since they are not immigrants or not Mexicans, they cannot truly understand some of the poems, especially the ones with a lot of cultural allusions in them. So the question is, what is your thought on this prevalent idea that we cannot relate culturally, historically, so they cannot truly understand poetry or literature in general? What thoughts do you have about that?
That's a good question. You know, for me, the way that I think about it was when I was growing up, there were very few books that I was given by teachers that included, you know, any characters with names that were shared by people in my family. You know what I mean? There were no Pedros, there were no Joses, there were no Marias in the books that I was reading. But, you know, like when I was reading Shakespeare, who's like this British dude, you know, from long ago, I was still expected to understand, even though, you know, I was growing up in Calumet City hundreds of years later, right? Like, I think I wanted to, when I was writing it, I wanted to welcome everybody in, but I wanted to make sure that I was kind of first and foremost adding some touches to make Latinx people, Latinx students feel seen. And then after that, you know, hopefully everybody else wants to come in and join in, you know what I mean? But I wanted to kind of, like, for example, one of the decisions that I made was not to translate words in Spanish into English, just to leave the Spanish alone. And I wanted to do that because I wanted Latinx students to know that they were the priority, because I just don't know that there's a ton of books that have them as a priority, that have us as a priority. So I wanted to begin there, and hopefully from that point on, you know, people can like look at their dictionary, can Google some things, and they can also be a part of the conversation. But I wanted to make sure that first and foremost, I was doing something for us, for like who I was as a young person when I was growing up, and not necessarily seeing myself in the books. So I wanted to start there. And so hopefully those students who maybe had a little bit of difficulty getting into some of the poems that had a lot of cultural allusions, you know, hopefully they look them up, you know what I mean? Like if you've never had a torta, you know what I mean? You're welcome. You should go get one. I know if you're in Boston, there's plenty of good places in Boston. Go to East Boston, spend some time in the neighborhood. go get yourself a torta with the Jamaica, you know, whatever. I promise it's worth your time. And even if you still don't love the poems, I think it's still worth your time. So that's kind of my answer. And I hope that that's helpful.
Well, I'm glad that you stated that, because even as I read the book myself, and I'm glad you ended with Mexican Heavens, because those were the ones that touched me the most. I could literally relate, and I'm not from Mexico, so I could actually connect my own experience with some of the illusions that you were actually using in some of those poems. So sometimes you have to go a little bit deeper and see where the parallels lie, so that you can make the connection. And that may be a process that some of our students are going through. So thank you for your candid response in how you approach that particular set of poems. There's another question from her students, and then I will allow those who are raising their hands to jump in and ask their questions as well. So the second question from her student states, it seems to me that some poems in the book try to delineate the liminal space that could be represented in the hyphen that you see in Mexican American or Asian American. In a conversation with Nate Marshall, a poet and your friend, where you talk about home and relocation to a new unknown place, you said, I think the places where I can most fully be myself and feel most seen are among my chosen family of artists and friends that encourage me to be my full self at all times. Can you share with us your process to find or create your home?
That's a really great question. Thank you. So I think one of the conflicts that I felt growing up was this idea of, where exactly is my home? Where do I belong? You know, my parents are from Jalisco, Mexico. I was growing up in Calumet City, Illinois. And I didn't, my parents are Mexican, but I didn't always feel necessarily like I was Mexican in the same way that they were Mexican. You know what I'm saying? Not that I didn't feel Mexican. I knew who I was in that way, but there were differences between us and how we related to the culture and the language and everything else. You know what I mean? They're much more, for example, they're much more strictly Catholic than I am. And yet at the same time, I can't deny the impact that Catholicism has had on me. You see it in a bunch of my poems, that it comes out, right? And then at the same time, I never fully felt American, right? There was, for example, when meeting new people, there's always the question of, where are you from? And if I say, I was born in Chicago, that's not a good enough answer, right? They're like, well, where are you really from? And what they mean is like, where's your family from? Where, they want to know what your ethnicity is. And I think growing up, I felt like I had to choose one or the other, right? And I think the process for me of finding home, and what I was talking to Nate about, was that I don't think we have to be so binary, right? I don't think that it's like a either or type of thing. I think that there are, I think what I've learned is that middle space, that liminal space that you're talking about, can be a home. And so for me, that's kind of where I feel most at home, is not necessarily strictly in one area. Like, I don't know that I have a dream, for example, of migrating back to Mexico, although I've spent time there and really love it. Like, I really love like the particularities of like American Latinx life, Mexican American life, or whatever. So for me, the answer that I come to in the book, and I think that I've come to in my life, is about kind of celebrating the in-between, and kind of taking the things that I love about American culture, and specifically like the culture that I grew up around in Chicago, and then also, of course, the culture that I was raised in by my parents, and Mexican culture, and kind of taking the parts that benefit me, and not necessarily like, my new poems, a lot of what I'm writing about is thinking about masculinity and machismo. And I think that that's one of those areas where like, I don't want to replicate some of the violences or some of the harms of like traditional machismo. And so I don't think that we have to like take 100% of anything. I think we have the power to choose like what parts actually feed us and what parts are maybe limiting to us. And so that's how I've kind of gone about trying to find home for myself.
That is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It is definitely a different process for every person, but I sort of like the way that you approach it, because it's much more broader and embracing. It's almost like when you talk about family, you acknowledge who your family is, but your family is also growing because they're those that you spend time, you relate to in the industry in which you are in as a poet. So thank you for your response to that question. There are 2 questions in the chat, and I'm going to go to those 2 questions, and then I'm going to go to those who have raised their hands and allow them to either express their questions verbally through their mics. So the first question in the chat states, what does it mean when the rats are fat as roosters?
That's a good question. That I'm trying to make an image that tells you how bad it gets in this like fictionalized, this dream Mexican heaven when the women go on strike and refuse to take care of the men, right? So I don't know how many, I mean, I know that this is true across many cultures where like the women are the most organized and they have the most responsibilities, like not just in terms of like work and, taking care of kids, but also of like maintaining the household, right? Cooking and cleaning and all of that stuff. So if all the women go on strike, at least in a lot of the Mexican families that I know, like the rats they would be having a feast. They would be having a good time. That's what I mean when I say that the rats are fat as roosters. I mean, they get really fat. They get as big as roosters. I don't know if you know roosters, but roosters are not little creatures, right? And so I'm just trying to paint a picture of like how gross it is because so many, I'll speak to Mexican men in particular, so many of us are, not very good at taking care of ourselves, or, so raised in this culture of like patriarchy that we don't know how to like cook and clean and do these things, or we refuse to, right? And so that's what I'm kind of talking about with that image.
Got it. Thank you. The next question in the chat states, do you think poetry was your calling in life? How did that come about? Or is that your sense?
That's a good question. I don't think poetry is my calling because I don't think about work as being necessarily my calling. I think my calling is to like be the best person I can be, right? Like be the best partner that I can be to my fiance, be the best son that I can be to my parents, be the best brother that I can to my brothers, be a good friend to my friends. Like I think those are bigger callings to me than writing poems. I started writing poetry when I was in high school, and there was something kind of mystical about it. I didn't really have any interest in poetry. It's not like I was reading tons of poetry growing up. Our high school happened to have a poetry slam team, and we got invited to go to like a presentation in the auditorium. And my choice was I could go to my 7th period class, which was chemistry, or I could get out of class to go to this poetry slam thing. And I didn't know what poetry slam was, but I was like, I know what chemistry is, so I'm out of here. and I went to go check out the poetry slam. And when I saw it, it just felt so powerful. And immediately it was like, it did feel kind of like an awakening. I was like, wow, like it was people my age, it was fellow students, it was people from the neighborhood. And it was the first time that I realized that every person can do more than just read. We can also like write our own stories. We can also speak back. We can, take issue with the way certain things are framed. We can, we can write back to the world. And so for me, that felt very powerful when I saw my classmates doing that. And I knew that I wanted to participate. I didn't know that it was going to be, such a big part of my career in my life. But I'm really grateful that it has been, because I think the biggest gift that poetry has given me, and it's given me a lot of gifts, like really great friends, a career. The biggest gift is that it's taught me to pay attention. And so I think that has helped me grow as a person in a lot of really good ways. I think it's made me kind of more accepting of who I am and who others are. I think it's made me less angry. So I'm really grateful to poetry for that.
Thank you, Jose. So the first person that I saw raise their hand is Emmy Sultana. So if you want, if we can unmute her, or I'm assuming it's a her, I'm not even sure. And you can share, ask your question.
Hi, Jose. My name is Amy. I'm an ELL student, level 3. And thank you so much for giving me a chance to ask you a question. So my question is, can you give any advice to someone wanting to write or publish a poetry? For the beginner, especially.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Emmy.
You're welcome.
My advice for people that want to write, I have 3 pieces of advice. My first piece of advice is to read as much as you can and read everything. Because when you're reading, everything kind of feeds you in ways that you don't even fully understand until you've sat down to write, and suddenly, you have new ideas. So I think reading widely is really important. I think it helps give us different understandings of how our own stories and our own writing styles might fit into the world. And it kind of shows us what's possible in the world, right? That we can write our stories in many different ways, that you don't have to just kind of write something beginning with the beginning and ending at the end, that sometimes it makes more sense to begin at the end and go backwards, right? Reading others' writing helps us understand all the ways that we can play with literature. So that's important. The second thing that I would say is, like, you have to make peace with the fact that in order to write good things, to write good poems, good essays, whatever you want to write, good stories, you're going to write bad stories and bad poems, and that's okay, right? I've written tons of quote unquote bad poems, and I think it's important to make peace with that, because that's part of the process. No one starts off writing masterpieces. That's just not how it goes. So you have to, like, give yourself the grace of learning in the space to kind of grow as a writer and an artist. And it's frustrating at times, because as you read more, you'll kind of have a vision for what you want your art to be and do. And it's hard when you can't quite do that yet, right? You're like an artist with a paintbrush. You know what you want to paint, but you can't make the picture yet the way that you want to. And it just takes lots of practice. So give yourself the grace to practice and get better. And then my last piece of advice is to try and find your community. It can be really lonely writing, and it's much easier when you have people that you trust with your art, that you can ask for feedback and advice. And so if you can find a community, whether it's friends, whether it's colleagues, whatever it may be, I think it's really important and really useful to try and foster that kind of space for yourself.
Awesome. Thank you, Jose, for your response. The next person I saw that raised their hand was Star Guerrero. So could we mute Star Guerrero so they can express their question.
Hello, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated your poetry. I think it spoke high volumes, and not really a question, but just a general appreciation. So thank you.
Thank you, Star. I appreciate it. Thank you for your appreciation.
Awesome. I also want to say thank you for acknowledging, because sometimes, you know, we get into a lot of Q&A, but it's also important to acknowledge what you have produced and what you have shared with us even this evening. The next person is Oscar Galindo. Can we unmute Oscar?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Jose, first and foremost, thank you so much for interacting with our BHCC library account. It was a lot of fun to see that interaction as well. So the question that I had was is, with the work that you did on podcasts when you were doing the Poetry Gods, I was wondering and curious, what was one of the most memorable interviews that you had that you feel had a direct impact on you as a poet today? Not necessarily your favorite, but the one that had the most impact for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. So my immediate answer, what first jumps to my mind is that, you know, I don't have formal training as a poet. I didn't go and get my MFA in creative writing, which is kind of the professional track that poets go on. So the podcast for me was really my training. Like when I talked to all of those writers as part of the podcast, and I got to ask them questions about their process and how they show up for this work, that was my training. That was kind of how I got my degree in poetry, was through those conversations. And I think the most impactful conversation out of all the interviews that we did was probably the conversation that we had with Araceli Skidmai, who, you know, I don't know, if you listen to the episode, you can probably tell that I'm very shy during that episode, because I've admired Araceli's poems for so long that, you know, I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of her. But I think a lot about her answers and just, you know, how kind and generous she was to us. And so that one is probably the one that I think about the most in terms of like writing advice and things that I've put forward in my own work. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I had a good time doing those podcasts, and and they were certainly very useful to me. So I hope they've been useful to other people as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Oscar. Can we unmute Cesar Almonte, who also raised his hand? Cesar, are you still there? Okay. Perhaps something shifted. The next person is Lydia. Can we unmute Lydia so she can share her inquiry?
Hi, Jose, thank you. It was great to listen to you. I have a question. So how do you planning to introduce the Mexican culture to your own kids, or do you feel that that culture is going to be lost with time because you live here and you don't live in Mexico?
That's a great question. Thank you, Lydia. I don't want the culture to be lost. And so, no, I don't think that it will be lost, because I don't have kids. I haven't, you know, occasionally my fiance and I will have those conversations about like, if we decide to have kids, where would they go to school? Where would we want to live, and all of that. But no, I wouldn't want it to be lost. To me, there's like a lot of beautiful things. I mean, part of it is also that like, there's so many Mexicans in the United States that they'd be around Mexican culture anyway. You know what I mean? Like Mexican culture is kind of ubiquitous in a lot of ways throughout the United States, even if it's marginalized in some other ways. But it would be really important to me that they know kind of where they come from and their history and all of this other stuff. So no, I wouldn't want it to be kind of like, yeah, it's something that I would definitely want to pass along to any children that I had. So I don't fully know the answer yet, how to do that, but it's definitely something that I've thought at least a little bit about.
Thank you, Jose, for your response. Next, we have Cesar is here. So Cesar, can we unmute Cesar and allow him to share his question? Is he having difficulties unmuting? So hopefully we can assist Cesar and get him in after this one if he's having some difficulties. So the next person is Amina Belkadi. Can we unmute her?
Hey, I got it.
You got in?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Cesar.
Hi, I'm Cesar, but my question is, where you go, where you is okay, I'm gonna say in Spanish. ¿De dónde tú te inspiras para hacer tus poemas?
Yeah, absolutely. Gracias, Cesar.
What
Lo que me
inspires you to
inspira-
write your poem? Is that what he asks?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. What inspires me, there's a whole lot of things that inspire me. Sometimes the poems come when I'm going on walks. I see something and it stays with me. Sometimes there's pieces from music that inspire me. One of my my youngest brother is here visiting me, and last year he put me on to Bad Bunny, and I've been like obsessed with trying to figure out how to write a Bad Bunny, like what would a Bad Bunny type poem look like, right? If you could capture like some of the ad libs that he adds to songs, how would you do that in a poem? So I haven't figured that out yet, but like that's inspiring to me. My brothers are always huge inspirations. They're like the funniest people I know, also like among the most stubborn people I know. So they're always inspiring me. But yeah, inspiration comes in a whole lot of places. My friends inspire me. Sometimes they like text me random things. And so I'm always kind of like delighted when they text me and then I try and write something. So I think the thing about inspiration is, you know, it's important to be proactive. If you're always waiting for inspiration, you know, you might be spending a lot of time waiting. And so I think it's easier for me anyway when I try and find inspiration myself. So when I sit down to write, even if I'm not necessarily inspired, and try to find inspiration through the act of writing, that helps me.
Awesome. Thank you, Jose. Amina, are you able to unmute? Are we able to unmute Amina so she can ask her question? Go ahead.
Do you hear? Okay, thank you so much for your present today. I really love your poems. My question is, what did you learn when you're writing your poems?
What do I learn when I'm writing my poems? Thank you, Amina. What I learn is a couple things. You know, one, I would say the importance of gentleness. You know, I was raised to be super competitive, not raised, but I learned to be super competitive, and that can make me hard sometimes. For example, like I'm really into video games. I'm really into NBA 2K specifically, And when we're losing, I can sometimes be really mean to my teammates because I want to win probably too much. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, it's just a video game and I'm not even that good at it. So why am I so worried? But the poems teach me to kind of, one, to not always censor myself, to be more gentle, to think about how I can move, not necessarily as the hardest worker and the most capitalist in some senses, but how they remind me that I can consider other ways of being, right? So that I don't always have to kind of be working and stressed out, that caring for my people is important and is worthy, and I don't need an excuse to do that, that caring for myself is important. And so the poems, I think, remind me about the importance of gentleness. So I hope that doesn't sound like a cop-out, but I think that that's really important to me. And I think that through time, they've taught me other things. Like when I was writing this first book, I think that it taught me to value the liminal spaces that we were talking about earlier. I think they give me reason to believe in ambiguity and not always having to have a definitive answer. So those are some of the things that come to mind.
Thank you, Jose. Appreciate that. Sophanie Thomas, can we unmute her so she can ask her question as well? Sophanie?
Hi, thank you so much for doing that. So my question is, what do you need to write a book? It is like you not only want to know the story, you have to like know more, like the place. Like for me, it's like doing marketing, doing like when people reading the books, they have to wanna go there, like the place you're talking about or what you're saying. And also, where did you get where did your inspiration come from? You can't only take it to your feeling, stuff like that. That's one of the reason I didn't follow that path, because I am really an emotional person. I only write about my feeling. Everything I'm writing is part of me. So, or something I watch or something like that. So where did you get it?
Yeah, I love that. I'm a pretty emotional person too. But what I found is that sometimes that immediate, when you have kind of that glow of emotion, that fire of emotion, that's not necessarily the best place to write from. Because, for example, when I'm angry, I'm only capable of anger. And when I'm only capable of anger, I write poems that are, too bright with anger. And sometimes that's useful and great, but other times that anger, if the whole poem is just flushed with anger, it feels too monotonous. And I mean monotonous, not necessarily as in boring, but it's too much of one thing. I kind of believe that poems need to have movements, right? I think all writing kind of needs to take us on some sort of emotional journey. And so it's easier for me to write from an emotional place when I have a little bit of distance from it, so that I can begin in anger and end in something else. So I can begin in clarity and end in anger, or begin in heartbreak and end in peace, or something like that. I think movement is an important part of making our poems kind of filled with surprise, so that the reader feels like you never want the reader to know what's going to happen from the first line. You want to, you know what I mean? Like if the reader only needs the first line, then what's the rest of the poem for? So you want to feel like you're giving them reason to keep reading, and surprises that are going to keep kind of enchanting them.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Stephanie, for that question. Can we unmute Anurada so they can ask their question?
Yes. Hello,
Go ahead.
everyone. Thank you so much. Okay. My question is that does your all poems are related to your real life? And the next thing is that I just want to know, like, when you started writing the poems and at what age, and then when you realize, like, okay, you are born for the poem, for the poetry. Like,
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. A lot of the poems, I would say that they begin in autobiography, but they are not, it's not like I'm writing autobiography. So at certain points, you know, sometimes I blend maybe two different facts into one poem, even though it didn't necessarily happen like that in real life. You know, I'm not always worried about capturing 100% of the facts. One, because I feel like all truth is kind of relative, right? Everyone has their own truths. And so I worry more about trying to capture the feeling of a moment rather than just the details. So a lot of, like I said, a lot of my poems begin in autobiography and in fact, but some of them take certain liberties or go, you know, kind of combine different stories. Then in terms of your other question, I started writing when I was like 14 or 15 years old. And I always meant to stop writing and I just never did. I kept writing and eventually decided that this was what I wanted to do. And I was lucky enough that I could, you know, that I had friends that were also choosing this. And so I could see how they were trying to make this a career. And so I was able to kind of follow them. And so for me, that was kind of how I decided to become a poet, was because I wasn't the only one making that decision. I think it's easier to choose becoming an artist when you have other people who are making that same choice and kind of taking that leap of faith with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jose. Can we unmute Fatima?
Hi. Hi, Jose. I'm so happy to meet you today. And I want to ask you about how do you feel about the labels that you have mentioned in your poem, The Mexican American Disambiguation? And what is your favorite poem? And thank you so much.
Thank you for your question, Fatima. The labels in Mexican American Disambiguation, you know, I don't know how I feel about them. I think certain identities sometimes make me feel powerful and other times they don't. And it kind of changes. When I was writing that poem, I wasn't necessarily thinking about those identity labels. I was thinking about how identity is fluid, right? Like how, you know, in certain rooms, we might be one thing, but in another room, we might be slightly different, or there might be like an additional identifier needed. Like, you know, I'm Mexican all the time, but when I'm hanging out with my parents, I'm Mexican in a slightly different way, right? Because their experience is such that they were born in Mexico and they were raised there, and their connection is different than mine. That was what I was thinking about, was like how our, you know, we use these identities to try and contain all of these multitudes, and yet our relationships to different places and identities is always changing. It's not like everyone has the same connection to Latinidad or to, you know, anything else. I think it's, those things are always moving. And then in terms of like what my favorite poem from the book is, I'd probably say my favorite poem from the book is Getting Ready to Say I Love You to My Dad, It Rains. And that's just because, you know, I really love my dad, and I think that's a poem that feels very much rooted in hope. So that's probably my favorite one today. Sometimes it changes.
Thank you, Jose. Can we unmute Yalisa Guzman. Go ahead, Yalisa.
Hi, good night, Jose. Nice to meet you. It's not a question, it's a comment. I say that in Spanish. Iba a decir que tus poemas son realmente como vivencias que vivimos cada día. Como por ejemplo, en donde escribiste Desambiguación México-Americana, donde dice mi papá se hizo ciudadano, lo cual no debe confundirse con las llaves de la casa. Estábamos a salvo de la deportación, que no debe confundirse con caminar por la tabla. Realmente creo que sentimos cada latino o inmigrante en esa parte donde dice que aunque estamos libres de la deportación, pero no debe confundirse de caminar por la tabla, o sea, de sentirse como totalmente libre.
Gracias, Yalisa. Para mí, eso es muy importante. Estaba tratando de escribir algo que yo no sé si nomás los latinos o inmigrantes, pero algo que se podía sentir como tú dices, como real y como algo que tenemos que vivir. Y para oír que tú sentiste eso, para mí es muy importante y me hace muy feliz. Entonces, gracias por tu comentario.
Thank you, Yalisa. Muchas gracias. Can we unmute Nikki?
Hi, Jose. We're reading about your book in class, and I actually like your poems because they're like simplistic, like you can actually it's relatable. And I was wondering, have you ever considered doing a podcast show where you read your poems or even like do general talking and conversation?
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate it. It's important to me. It's important to me that I write poems that that can be read and shared. Like I believe that poetry is a communal art, right? Like I think it's for me, it's the most moving when I'm like sharing it with people. And so one of the coolest things, I know that this isn't exactly your question, but I had a friend of mine tell me that like her and her girlfriend were like reading my poems to each other like before bed. And to me, that was like the coolest thing, that you could share poems that way. So thank you for that. In terms of your question, I would love to do a podcast one day, another one. I'm also, so I don't know if you saw this, but Rupi Kaur, who's another poet, is doing like a poetry special on Amazon Prime, kind of like a stand-up special, but with her poems. So I would love to do something like that one day. I think that'd be cool. I think I'd be pretty good at it. So we'll see. I would love to do all sorts of things. Yeah, but we'll see what the future holds.
All righty. Good luck.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Jose. Can we unmute Courtney? Courtney Roach.
Hi, it wouldn't unmute for a second. Jose, it was really good to hear you, and I'm really happy that I jumped on, and I'm so happy you just made a Rupi Kaur, connection, because I was actually thinking of her as you were talking, and but I was just like, like I love writing and like I'm really into writing, but like how did you get the confidence to be able to, especially on Zoom, to sit and like share with like confidence, especially your own writing? Like it's easy to read somebody else's, but to read your own is so hard. And it just like really inspires me when people can like sit and read their own writing to a group of people, especially on Zoom.
Thank you, Courtney. So for me, that confidence, so I have a lot of stage fright. And when I was younger, it was way worse than it is now. But at this point, I've had so much practice reading my poems out loud that I know, even though I still have some nerves and some fears, those never go away, and that's okay. But I have the experience of knowing, I believe, of knowing that nothing bad is going to happen. I've done it enough that I kind of can reassure myself. So for me, the confidence comes from practice. It's kind of like swimming, like it's scary at first to go out into the water, but you can't swim by, reading a book and staying on land. You kind of have to slowly practice at it. So I would say if it's something that you're interested in doing, like try finding some low stakes way of practicing. Like maybe, sometimes it's scarier to read poems for your friends than it is to read them for strangers. But if it's not scary to you to read poems for people you trust, then maybe start with that and see if then you could go to, they're like Zoom open mics and things like that. So someone, for example, in the chat mentioned the Dirty Jaren. So, there's always local events and ways to kind of build your practice. The more you practice, the easier it becomes. So the scariest poems for me to read now are kind of newer poems because I don't know what the reaction is going to be. I don't know if people are going to like those poems, if they're going to be like, I hated the new poems, read more of the old poems, whatever. So those poems are scarier to read. But it's still important for me. That this is also one of the ways that I get feedback. It's how I know if what I'm doing is working or not. So it's also how I learn about my own work. So it's important. It's an important part of my process.
Thank you, Jose. We have Din Lee. Can we unmute Din Lee?
Hi. My question is, when did you start write your first poem, and why you choose poetry to tell everybody about your feeling, your thought, instead of other ways?
That's a great question. Thank you. I started writing poetry when I was like 14 or 15 years old. And I don't know that I chose poetry so much as poetry kind of chose me. I think that I was really quiet as a teenager and I was looking for an outlet. And it just so happened that the outlet that I found was poetry, right? It was through Poetry Slam. I think if my classmates, if kind of the way that I found that outlet was something else, then I would have, maybe done something else. But for me, the way that I learned that I could express myself, that I could have this outlet was by watching, classmates read their poems. And that's when I learned that like, oh, poetry is open to teenagers. That's all I knew. I didn't know that, novels were open to teenagers or short stories were open to teenagers. All I knew was that poetry had possibilities for me. And so that made me want to write poems. And so, I don't know that I chose it. Like I said, I think it was kind of, one of those lucky coincidences.
Thank you, Jose. And we do apologize to those who we may not have gotten to your question. We have one more that we want to unmute, and I think that's sort of concluding our evening for tonight. So this is the last question. Can we unmute Carl? Is Carl still here?
Yes, sorry. I'm Native American, and I know lots of Mexicans and people of that culture are Native American, or we're from this land. So, do you consider yourself a part of any tribe? And if you do you think maybe an influence has been given to you to write your poetry?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Carl. So much of, I've gone in search of like the history of my family, but so much of it has been lost. my parents, my grandparents were like farmers, and before that they were farmers. So there's not a ton of like paper trail. My parent, no one in my family before migration was really like a bureaucrat or anything like that. And so it's made it hard for me. So I don't know exactly like what part of my family is indigenous and what exactly that indigenous tribe is. But to answer your second part, like I've been greatly inspired by indigenous writers and can see clear connections in some of the things that they're talking about and some of the things that I've witnessed in my own life. Like one of my biggest inspirations is the writer Natalie Diaz, who's an incredible poet and hugely influential to me. So I mean, I think it's true for a lot of different writers of color where like you know, someone, for example, mentioned, I think it was you, Carlos, in your first question about, or second question about like the hyphenated identities and like also Asian Americans, right? Like, even though, I'm not Asian American, I see a lot of similarities between some of those questions, right? Like, what exactly do we mean by API and who's included and who's not? And what kind of stories do we want to tell, right? So for me, yeah, I see lots of possibilities and lots of inspiration in the works of other writers of color, especially indigenous writers. So thank you, Carl.
Jose, we want to really thank you for engaging with us tonight for our compelling conversation, the first one of this fall. And it's really been a pleasure having you here, sharing your art, expressing yourself through spoken word and your poetry, and also interacting with students, faculty, staff, and even administrators who are here. There were some additional questions, but we recognized that our time was limited. So hopefully, if we can compile those through the chat and maybe make them available to you, you will at least hear what people's were thinking, what was in their heart. So we truly thank you for being with us tonight. And this time, I'm going to ask our team from our College Cultural Events Office to just put up the slide, because our next compelling conversation is going to be with Larry Spada-Croman, and it's going to be on the 5th of October. So for all those who are available, please join us for this next compelling conversation. It's been great to have Jose Olivarez with us, the author of our one book for this year. And once again, we just thank him. So can you just show him your love? You can clap, you can use one of those emojis that just shows how much we appreciate having you at Bunker Hill Community College. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much for having me. Much love to all of Bunker Hill Community College. Thank you, everybody.